So you've probably got a multi-tool, some levers, and maybe a hand pump to fix your bike on the trails. But if you've been thinking about putting together a toolbox for fixing your bike at home, then this is the video for you. I'm going to be explaining all of those essential tools for maintaining your mountain bike. So hopefully you've got some tyre levers and a hand pump so that you can fix punctures when you're out on the trail. But when you're at home, a floor pump or a track pump will be so much quicker and so much easier. This is definitely a first purchase for your home maintenance. I will always use this before I leave the house, every time before I leave the house, to check I've got the right tyre pressure. And the floor pumps will usually come with a pressure gauge that's quite accurate on the top as well. And this one is a Joe Blow booster from Toe Peak. And what that means is it has an extra canister, as you can see here, which you can charge up effectively into a high pressure and then release it into your tires in one go. And that makes things really easy if you're setting up tubeless tires, because that way the air doesn't seep out of the tires when you're just putting in a small amount of air at a time. A little bonus gadget for you here, which isn't essential, but is definitely nice to have, and that is a tyre pressure gauge. Now, these are very small, they can fit in your backpack, and they check the accuracy of your pumps or the accuracy of the air pressure in your tyres, because some pumps will register differently between hand pumps and track pumps. So this makes sure that your tyre pressure is the same no matter what pump you're using. If you're pumping up the air in your tyres, then you need to be pumping up the air in your suspension as well. And there is a specific pump for that. This is a shock pump. It's slightly different because it goes up to much higher PSI. And also it has a slightly different attachment, as some people are running Presta valves on their wheels, and this is a Schrader attachment and it screws on as well. So it is very specific for suspension. And you'll need this to keep up on top of the air, because it does release from your suspension much like tires go down over time. But also it's really handy to get more accurate with setting up the sag, especially if you're running a full suspension bike. On your bike, there's a lot of bolts, and most of those will be hex shaped or they'll be Torx shaped. So you'll need some Allen keys and some Torx keys. Now, you might get away with a multi-tool that has all of the keys that you require, but sometimes a multi-tool can be a little bit bulky when it comes to getting into small places, and sometimes there's not enough leverage to undo really tightened bolts. So for that reason, a good set of Allen keys like this is a really good idea. Now, these are actually more professional grade T-handles from Park Tools. You don't have to go this fancy, but there are some added benefits. Having the longer arm means that you can undo, you have more leverage to undo tightened bolts. You also have the kind of action of loosening things a little quicker. And this is a strip gripper on one side. It's effectively a twisted version of the standard hex key. And that is there to loosen damaged bolts, which sometimes, let's be honest, happens. Something else to add to the list is some bike-specific grease. Something like this bicycle assembly grease from PT's would be ideal to help you put the bolts in smoothly, and also helps prevent them from seizing over time. Now, if you've got a lot of carbon components, maybe handlebars or stems or a frame, you might want to consider some max grip as well, or some kind of grit inserted grease, as this will add friction between the two components, so that can help stop them slipping over time or under a lot of pressure, maybe when we're actually riding. And also it helps with the torquing process because it adds friction. Talking of torquing, we will need some torque wrenches, especially if you've got any carbon components or a carbon frame on your bike. And that is because if we over tighten bolts on components or frames, we could risk damaging them, cracking them, breaking them, or even stripping the threads on the bolts. So to prevent us from over tightening, we use torque wrenches because it puts a limit on how much pressure we put through those bolts. So they will usually be something like this, like a stick form, where you adjust the torque setting on the bottom, and you'll adjust it according to the maximum Newton meters that is set by that component. Sometimes it's written on the component itself, and sometimes you might need to look it up on the internet or your user manual. Now you can get small ones that attach little Allen keys, for example, which will be great for doing up bolts on seat posts and handlebars, stems, that sort of thing. But a larger one like this would be great for anyone who is thinking about using extra things like sockets, or maybe if you're attaching bottom bracket or changing chain rings that are direct mount on your cranks, for example. These will have different attachments to something like this. So it's entirely possible that you might need a small one for all your little bolts, and then a bigger one for things like chain rings and bottom brackets. Absolutely essential tool for your chains and your gearing is a chain checker. So this will effectively measure how much your chain has stretched or elongated over time, because the idea is if you can replace it before it gets too stretched, then it won't wear out your cassette and your chain rings by being misaligned. So this will tell you when to replace your chain effectively. And when it comes to that time, you will need a chain breaker or a chain splitter. Now, a lot of multi-tools will have a chain breaker on there, but I like to have a workshop specific one that's a lot bigger. It'll give you a bit more force for pushing the pins out of the chain, and it'll be a bit more accurate as well. So effectively, you may have a quick link to remove your chain, but when you put the new one on, you're going to need to shorten it down to the correct length. So you will need a chain breaker in order to do that. Now, I mentioned a quick link, and there are some pretty Heath Robinson ways of taking those off, but if you can get a quick link plier set, that will make it much easier to undo, and you can also use these to do them up as well. So if we're fixing and maintaining our gears, say our shifters and our derailleur, for example, usually those will take Allen keys, so we're already sorted there. But sometimes the shifter, if you're opening the port and removing a cable and replacing it, sometimes those require a Phillips or a flathead screwdriver to open. So it's a good idea to have these around just in case the need arises. Now, in order to maintain your cassette or to replace it, you're going to need a cassette removal tool, which looks something like this. Now, the fitment is actually pretty standard across all brands, so whether you're using Shimano or SRAM, it will be the same. Just keep an eye out for this length of rod here in the center. Sometimes that can be specific to brands, so I would get one that's very, very short, and then you should be good to go. And you'll need this to either go into a specific tool in order to loosen it and have the leverage to open that cassette or to loosen that cassette. But you can, if you want to save a bit of money, get this and use an adjustable spanner that you've got at home, perhaps. In order to loosen it, because you will find that the cassette will move backwards as you try and loosen it, you will need something to keep the cassette in place. So you'll need something like this, which is Park Tools cassette pliers, which will actually pincer and hold the cassette in place and stop it rotating as you're loosening the cassette. Now, typically we see a chain whip being used. The problem with the chain whip, sometimes you need a specific speed of chain in order for it to fit around the cassette. So I do prefer these if the budget stretches to it. And if you're replacing cassettes, you're probably replacing gear cables as well. So you might want to get yourself some cable cutters. Now, a bike-specific cable cutter like this will be be sharp enough to cut the gear cable and for it to not fray, for example, but also it comes with a little handy attachment here, which will crimp those ends that go on the end of your gear cable, which further stops them fraying. And also, because they're bike specific, they will be sharp enough to use on outer gear cables without them fraying too. So bike specific cable cutters, a little bit better than normal cable cutters. If you have hydraulic disc brakes on your bike, chances are you're going to need a brake bleeding kit in order to service those brakes. So a brake bleeding kit ensures that you can flush out the fluid in your system because over time you might get air or dirt or water ingress, or it might just degrade and then your brakes become quite spongy. So a brake bleeding kit will help attach to the brakes and change the fluid in the system, or at least bleed the air out of the system. And you will have specific fitment requirements for different brands and different models, so you will need to get a kit specific for your brakes. And you'll also need the fluid that is specific for your brakes. So for example, a lot of the time Shimano use mineral fluid, and a lot of the time, although not always, SRAM will use DOT fluid, and you need the specific fluid for your specific model, and also the kit specific for your model too. And some bonuses here, which aren't necessarily tools, but are very essential for workshop maintenance. And that is some rubber gloves, or often referred to as nitrile gloves. And these will obviously keep your hands nice and clean, but they are also there for safety, because some greases and some fluids, certainly DOT fluid that you might be putting into your brakes, can be harmful and corrosive. So this will protect you. And if you are working on your brakes, then some disc brake cleaner would be a really good idea to make sure that no fluid is left on your brakes or your pads or your discs, because contaminants can stop them from working effectively. So this will clean that up. And I usually use Blue Roll with this to wipe anything, because it's nice and fresh and we can dispose of the contaminant. But when you're working on your chain or the rest of your bike, a rag or an old t-shirt will be just fine, because you can wipe things down, keep things clean, and then just wash it and reuse it. And don't forget some lubricant. Obviously, that keeps your chain working nice and smoothly and keeps it nice and quiet, but it also prolongs the life of that chain. So it means less maintenance for you, which maybe that's a sad thing now that you've got your new toolbox and your workstation. Anyway, if I've missed any essential tools, then do let me know down in the comments below. Is there a tool you always reach for? Have I missed anything? Let me know, and have fun.